He slammed his fist so hard that the mahogany desk cracked clean down the middle, and not a single man in that room dared breathe. 7 years. 7 years since anyone had heard Cassian Ferraro laugh. 7 years since a smile had touched that iron face. His men called it grief. His enemies called it warning. Everyone agreed on one thing: whatever that man had buried the night his brother died, he buried it deep enough that nothing would ever dig it back up. Until the morning a woman from the mountains started humming in his hallway. If this story already has your heart, hit that subscribe button right now and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The envelope hit the desk at 6:47 in the morning. Marco Cassian is head of security, a man built like a refrigerator and twice as cold, set it down without a word and stepped back 3 paces. That was the protocol. You delivered what needed to be delivered. You stepped back, you waited, you did not speak unless spoken to. You especially did not speak when Cassian Ferraro was already standing at the window with his jaw set like stone and his coffee untouched. 3 applicants left, Marco said anyway, because the silence had stretched past its limit. Cassian didn't turn around. I told Rosa to handle it. Rosa quit. That got a reaction. Barely, a slight tightening of the shoulders, a pause in the act of not drinking his coffee. When Pema, yesterday evening, said she couldn't work in a house that felt like a funeral anymore. Marco kept his voice perfectly flat. Her words, sir, not mine. Cassian turned from the window then. He looked at Marco the way a man looks at a weather report he doesn't like, acknowledging it, not accepting it. Fine. Send whoever's left to Mrs. Bianchi for screening. I don't want to meet them. You said that last time. And I meant it last time. Don, the last maid cried in the pantry for 40 minutes after you looked at her in the hallway. Cassian picked up the envelope. Then find someone who doesn't cremon. That was how the morning started. By 9 o'clock, 2 of the 3 remaining applicants had already gone home. The first one took one look at the entrance hall, the dark wood, the absolute silence, the way every person on staff moved like they were afraid to make sound, and she said very politely that she had just remembered a prior commitment. The second one made it as far as the kitchen, before Mrs. Bianchi, the household manager, mentioned in passing that the previous head maid had lasted 11 months before having what she diplomatically described as a stress-related medical event. That left one. She was sitting in the service entrance hallway on a wooden chair with a worn canvas bag at her feet and her hands folded in her lap. Mrs. Bianchi had kept her waiting for 45 minutes, a test of sorts, not a deliberate one. But things moved slowly in Cassian Ferraro's house, and if a person couldn't handle waiting with a still spine, they certainly couldn't handle the rest of it. The woman was still there when Mrs. Bianchi came back, still seated, hands still folded. You're Jolene Marsh, Mrs. Bianchi asked, though she had the file right there in front of her. Yes, ma'am. You drove from, she checked the paper, West Virginia. Yes, ma'am, 18 hours. Mrs. Bianchi looked up. Why, Jolene Marsh looked back at her with dark brown eyes that carried something in them. Not desperation exactly, not pride exactly, but something settled between the two, like a woman who had already made peace with how hard things were going to get before they got better. Because the position pays 3 times what I was making back home, she said. And I've got reasons that require 3 times the income. Miss Bianchi had interviewed over 40 candidates in the past 14 months. Not one of them had given her an answer that plain or that honest. She hired her on the spot. Jolene Marsh got the standard orientation. The rules of the house, Mrs. Bianchi explained, were not suggestions. They were not guidelines. They were rules. You do not initiate conversation with Mr. Ferraro, Mrs. Bianchi said as she walked her through the service corridor. You do not make eye contact unless he speaks to you directly. You do not ask questions about his personal sale, his schedule, his guests, or his business. You do not enter the East Wing without explicit instruction. You do not enter his study under any circumstances. What if there's a fire? Jolene asked. Mrs. Bianchi stopped walking. She turned around. Jolene met her eyes calmly. I'm just asking, in case. For one long moment, the older woman just looked at her. Then against what appeared to be her better judgment, the corner of her mouth moved not quite a smile, but the memory of one. In case of fire, Mrs. Bianchi said carefully, you alert the staff. You do not personally enter the study. Are we clear, Crystal? Good. You'll be handling the main floor. East wing is off limits. The staff dining room is at the end of the service hall. You eat before the household or after? Never during. During what? During whatever mood he's in. Mrs. Bianchi lowered her voice just slightly. You'll learn to read it. They all do. The trick is to learn it fast and adjust faster. Mr. Ferraro does not have tantrums. He does not raise his voice. What he does is go very quiet, and when that happens, you want to be somewhere else. Jolene nodded slowly. How long have you worked here? 12 years. And you're still standing. Barely, the older woman said, and this time it almost sounded like a joke. Come on, I'll show you the supply closet. She met him on the third day, not by design, not by accident exactly either. More the way that two things moving in different directions eventually occupy the same space regardless of anyone's intentions. Jolene had been up since 5. She'd already gone through 2 floors, had the kitchen linen sorted, the main hallway done, and was working her way through the sitting room off the east corridor when she heard footsteps. Not hurried, not shuffling. The kind of footsteps that belonged to a man who had never once in his life moved through a space like he was afraid of it. She kept working. The footsteps stopped. She kept working. You're new. His voice was low, not loud, not harsh exactly, but the kind of voice that had been trained or maybe just worn into something that left no room for misunderstanding. It wasn't a greeting, it was an observation delivered the way a person notes the weather. Factual, requiring no response. She gave one anyway. Yes, sir. Started Monday. A pause. You were told the rules. I was. You're in the east corridor. She straightened up and turned around. Cassian Ferraro was standing 6 feet away, and he looked exactly like what he was, a man who had not smiled in so long that his face had reorganized itself around the absence of it. Dark hair, early 40s, eyes the color of harbor water in winter. Not cold exactly, just very, very still. Mrs. Bianchi showed me the boundaries, Jolene said. I'm 2 rooms west of the restricted area. I checked the floor plan. Something shifted in his expression. Not softening, more like recalibration. You checked the floor plan, he repeated. I like to know where I am, she said, especially in a new place. It helps me work faster if I'm not second-guessing the geography. He looked at her for a moment. The way a man looks at something unexpected, not pleased, not displeased, just genuinely surprised to find it there. Get back to work, he said. Yes, sir. And he walked away. Later in the staff dining room, one of the other maids, a girl named Petra, who had been there 4 months and had moved through the house like a ghost, deliberately stared at Jolene over a bowl of soup with something between admiration and horror. He spoke to you, briefly. What did you say? That I checked the floor plan. Petra stared. And you're still here. Still here, Jolene confirmed and took a bite of her dinner. By the end of the first week, a pattern had formed. Jolene arrived before dawn. She worked methodically, no rushing, no corners, cut, no unnecessary noise. She was not invisible the way the other staff were invisible. She was simply present in the way that competent people are present, quietly, completely, without demanding acknowledgement for it. And she hummed, not loudly. Barely above a whisper, really, just the thread of a melody she carried through her work, the way some people carry worry. Old mountain songs, the kind that don't have clean endings, the kind that were written by people who understood that life doesn't resolve neatly. She didn't think anyone noticed. She was wrong. On Thursday morning, she was in the main hallway when she heard the study door open. She went quiet instinctively, not from fear, but from habit, the old instinct of a woman who had learned to read the room early in life. She heard Cassian's footsteps cross the marble. She heard them stop. Then, don't stop. She looked up. He was at the end of the hall, not looking at her, coat in hand, heading for the door. Sir, the humming. He didn't turn around. Don't stop on my account. The front door opened. He was gone. Jolene stood there for a full 10 seconds. Then she went back to her work. And after a moment, almost without deciding to, she started humming again. It was the second week when she first saw the photograph. She wasn't snooping. She was dusting the shelf in the upper sitting room, another room that felt like a place where time had decided to stop. And there it was between a book and a brass clock that she had noticed was always wound, but never set to the right time. Two men, young, early 20s maybe. One of them was clearly Cassian, the same jaw, the same stillness in his posture, even at that age. But the other one was laughing, throwing his head back with his whole chest, the way people only laugh when they are completely unguarded, completely safe, completely urged that this moment is good and the next one will be too. They had the same face. Not identical, but close enough that she understood without being told. A brother. She set the photograph down exactly where she'd found it and went back to dusting. She didn't say anything. She didn't ask. But that night in the small room off the service quarters where she slept, she thought about that laugh. About what it must have cost a man like Cassian Ferraro to have had something that free in his world and then lose it. She thought about her daughter Rosie asleep 3 states away in her sister's house with a heart that the doctors said needed fixing before she turned 9. She thought about the number on the medical bill, a number so large it had ceased to feel real and started to feel like a wall she was supposed to just walk through somehow. She understood in her bones what it meant to hold grief and duty in the same 2 hands at the same time. She didn't sleep much that night. The breaking point came on a Tuesday and it came fast. Jolene was passing the study with a stack of fresh linens, not entering. Just passing when she heard it, not shouting. Cassian didn't shout. What she heard was the controlled, terrifying sound of a man who was barely holding something enormous in check. I said I want answers, not excuses. His voice through the closed door was so low it barely carried. If I don't have a name by Friday, I will find one myself, and you know what happens when I stop waiting and start looking. A murmur on the other side, someone on the phone, someone afraid. I don't care about the politics. I care about my brother. Are we finished misunderstanding each other? Silence. Good. Jolene had pressed herself against the wall without meaning to. Not from fear, or not entirely from fear. From the weight of it. The way grief sounds when it's been forged into something hard and dangerous over 7 years of use. She knew that sound. She'd heard it in her own voice in the dark, in the car, after doctor visits that ended with paperwork and not answers. The study door opened. Cassian stopped when he saw her. She was holding the linens. She hadn't moved. She met his eyes directly, not defiantly, not apologetically, just honestly. I was here, I heard that. I'm not pretending otherwise. His jaw tightened. The east corridor linens go to the closet on the left, he said. Not this one. Yes, sir. She adjusted her grip on the stack. I'll remember. She walked on. She heard him stand in the hallway for a moment before his footsteps resumed. That night, Petra found her in the kitchen and sat down across from her with the expression of someone delivering a warning. Whatever you're doing, Petra said, be careful. I'm not doing anything. That's the thing. Petra leaned forward. Everyone in this house does something they avoid. They disappear. They become furniture. You were the only one who just is. And he's starting to notice that. She paused. In this house, getting noticed by that man is either the best thing that ever happened to you or the worst. No one knows which until it's too late. Jolene wrapped both hands around her mug and said nothing. Petra got up to leave, then stopped. Why did you really come here 18 hours from West Virginia isn't about a paycheck? Jolene looked at her. My daughter needs heart surgery, the kind that costs more than I would have made in 10 years back home. Petra was quiet for a long moment. How old is she? 7. Another long silence. I'm sorry, Petra said. Don't be. I'm going to fix it. Jolene said it the way she might state a fact about the weather. Calm, certain, like a woman who had already had the conversation with herself 100 times and arrived at the only answer she was willing to accept. I just need time and the right job. Petra left without saying anything else, but she stopped flinching every time she passed Jolene in the corridor. And that in its own small way was something. It was the end of the second week when the real shift happened quiet, as a door swinging on a well-oiled hinge, almost invisible and absolutely impossible to undo. Cassian had not eaten dinner in the main dining room since his brother died. Everyone on staff knew this. It was not discussed, not questioned. He ate in the study or didn't eat at all, and the kitchen prepared his meals and left them and pretended not to notice when they came back untouched. On that Friday evening, Jolene was walking the main corridor at 7:30 when she passed the dining room doorway and saw him standing at the window. Not sitting, not eating, just standing in front of the long table set for one with his hands at his sides and his back to the room, and something in the line of his shoulders that was not anger this time. It was exhaustion. She should have kept walking. Every rule of the house said to keep walking. Every ounce of professional sense she had said to keep walking. She stopped. Mr. Ferraro. He turned around slowly like a man surfacing from somewhere deep. She nodded toward the table. It's getting cold. A beat of silence. He looked at the table, then back at her. Is that your business? He asked. Not threatening, genuinely asking. Right now it is, she said, because I'm the one who will be cleaning it up either way, and food wastes easier cold than it wastes hot, and either way it wastes, and that's a shame. He stared at her. She held her ground, and she would think about this later in the quiet of her room, and she would wonder if she had imagined it. She saw something shift in his face. Not a smile, nothing as large as that, but the first tremor of one, somewhere deep underneath, like a fault line barely moving but moving. He sat down. He picked up his fork. You're the strangest employee this house has ever had, he said. I'll take that as a compliment, sir. It wasn't offered as one. I know. She turned to leave, but I'm taking it anyway. She was almost at the door when he spoke again, quiet without looking up from his plate. What's your daughter's name? She stopped walking. She didn't ask how he knew. In a house like this, in a life like his, information moved through the walls. She understood that. Rosie, she said. He said nothing, just nodded once to his plate, as if filing it somewhere. She left, and the meal came back to the kitchen for the first time in years empty. The empty plate made it through the kitchen in silence, but nothing in that house stayed silent for long. By morning, Mrs. Bianchi had heard about it. By noon, Petra had told the two kitchen staff. By the time Jolene arrived for her shift the next day, the entire household had rearranged itself around a single fact for the first time and longer than most of them had worked there. Cassie and Ferraro had finished a meal. Nobody said a word to Jolene directly. They didn't have to. She felt it in the way people moved around her. Not with the careful avoidance they'd shown in her first week, but with something closer to cautious curiosity. Like people watching a stranger walk across ice that everyone else had been too afraid to step on. She kept her head down and went to work. That morning, she found a vase of fresh flowers on the supply cart that hadn't been there before. No note, no explanation. She looked at Mrs. Bianchi, who was studying a clipboard with great concentration. Those for the main sitting room, Jolene asked. Wherever you think they belong, Mrs. Bianchi said, still reading the clipboard. Jolene picked up the vase and carried it to the hallway off the main staircase, the one with the photograph. She set it 2 feet from the frame, not next to it, just near enough that the room felt less like a stopped clock. She went back to work and didn't think about it again. But she noticed that evening that the flowers hadn't been moved. Cashin noticed things. This was not a personality trait so much as a survival mechanism built over years of operating in a world where the detail you missed was the one that killed you. He noticed the flowers. He noticed exactly where they'd been placed. He noticed that the distance between the vase and the photograph was deliberate, close enough to acknowledge, far enough to not intrude. He stood in that hallway for 40 seconds, which was 39 seconds longer than he usually stood anywhere. Then he walked to his study and closed the door. Marco was already inside, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and the particular expression he wore when he had information that wasn't going to land well. Talk, Cashin said. The Vanchetti family is asking questions about the shipment schedule, not formally, just asking. Marco shifted his weight. The kind of asking that means they already know and want to see if we'll lie. What do they know? Enough to be a problem, not enough yet to be a move. Marco paused. You want me to reach out? No, Cashin sat down. I want you to find out who told them, because someone did. He picked up a pen, set it down, picked it up, again a habit Marco had learned to read as precision thinking, not restlessness. And while you're finding that out, find out where Dante Vanchetti is spending his Friday nights. Marco raised an eyebrow. Information is leverage, Cassian said. We collect it before we need it, not after. Understood. Marco straightened up, then hesitated in the way he did when he had something to say that wasn't strictly business. It was a short hesitation he'd learned over 12 years to keep it brief. The new maid, Cassian didn't look up. What about her? The staff is talking. The staff is always talking. About you, Marco said. About the dinner. About the fact that she's the first person in this house who talks to you like a... He stopped, recalibrated. Like a person. A long silence. She does her job, Cassian said finally. She does, Marco agreed. She also has a 7-year-old daughter with a congenital heart defect who needs surgery within the next 8 months, or the window closes. He set a thin folder on the desk. I ran a background check. Standard procedure. Cassian looked at the folder. Didn't open it. Close the door on your way out, he said. Marco left. The folder sat on the desk for the rest of the evening. Cassian didn't open it. He also didn't move it. He worked around it the way you work around something you aren't ready to look at yet, but can't quite bring yourself to put away. Thursday arrived with a cold front and a problem. The problem came in the form of a phone call that reached Jolene through Mrs. Bianchi at 7 in the morning. Ms. Bianchi knocked on the doorframe of the laundry room and her face said everything before her mouth did. Your sister called, on the house line. A pause. It's about your daughter. Jolene set down the sheet she was folding. Very carefully, very slowly, the way a person sets things down when their hands have stopped feeling like their own. What happened? She's stable, Mrs. Bianchi said quickly. She's stable, but she had an episode last night. The doctors said it's a warning sign. They want to move the surgery timeline up. She held out a piece of paper with a number on it. Your sister said to call when you can. Jolene took the paper. She looked at the number written there, not the phone number, the other number, the one her sister had written in the corner, the way you write something down so you don't forget it even when you want to. The surgery cost. It had gone up. She stood very still for a moment. Then she folded the paper, once put it in her apron pocket and said, Thank you, Mrs. Bianchi. Take a few minutes, dear. The laundry will... I'm fine. She picked the sheet back up. I've got a system going. I'll lose the rhythm if I stop. Mrs. Bianchi watched her for a moment, then nodded quietly and left. Jolene folded sheets for the next 40 minutes without stopping. Her hands worked automatically, muscle memory, carrying her through the motions while something else entirely moved through her chest. Not panic, not tears. Something harder and heavier than both. The cold arithmetic of love, which is the calculation you run when someone you would die for needs something you cannot yet give them. She worked through it. Because that was the only thing she knew how to do. She didn't hear him come in. The laundry room was off the service quarter, rarely used by anyone but staff, and she had been so deep inside her own head that she didn't register the footsteps until he was already standing in the doorway. Cassian. Not looking at her exactly. Looking past her at the far wall in the way of someone who has walked somewhere without entirely deciding to. She straightened up. Mr. Ferraro, this area isn't, is there something you need? No. He said it like a man who's realized mid-sentence that he doesn't have a good reason for being somewhere. He stayed anyway. Mrs. Bianchi told me about the call. Jolene kept her face even. I'm sorry if it interrupted the house routine. It won't happen again. That's not what He stopped, tried again. Is the child all right? Something cracked just slightly in the center of Jolene's composure. She pressed it back down with everything she had. She's stable, she said. The doctors want to move the surgery up. That means I need to move faster too. She met his eyes. I'm not going anywhere, Mr. Ferraro, in case that's what you're wondering. I'm not the kind of person who abandons a commitment because the road gets harder. He looked at her for a long moment. I wasn't wondering that. Then what were you wondering? The question landed between them, honest and direct, and he didn't have a quick answer for it, which was unusual enough that it shifted something in the air. How old were you when you learned to do that? He asked instead. Do what? Keep going when everything's falling apart around you. Keep your hands moving and your face straight and just keep going. Jolene considered that. About 6, she said. Mama got sick when I was little. Somebody had to make sure the younger ones had breakfast before school. His jaw moved, not toward a smile, toward recognition, the quiet, painful kind. My brother learned it from me, he said, and it was clearly not something he'd planned to say. The words came out low and unguarded, and he seemed to hear them the same time she did, and something behind his eyes shuddered briefly. Nico, Jolene said before she thought better of it. His eyes sharpened immediately. You know his name? The photograph, she said honestly. I saw the photograph in the sitting room. I didn't ask anyone. I didn't look anything up. You can tell from a photo when someone is loved. She held his gaze. I'm sorry about your brother. The silence that followed was not comfortable, but it was real. That was something. People say that a lot, Cassian said finally. I know they do. I meant it differently. How? She thought about it before she answered. I meant I'm sorry that you lost the person who made you laugh. Because you can replace a lot of things in this life. You can't replace that. He was very still. Then he said quietly and almost to himself, no, you can't. He left without another word. She listened to his footsteps go down the corridor, unhurried, same as always, but somehow different. Like a man carrying a weight, he'd shifted from one shoulder to the other. Same weight, slightly different posture. Jolene went back to the sheets. Her hands were shaking now, just slightly. She let them. That night, something unprecedented happened. Jolene was in the service hallway when Marco appeared at the other end and said with the expression of a man delivering orders, he didn't write. Mr. Ferraro would like you to leave the east corridor for last tomorrow morning. He'll be out of the study before 9. She blinked. He's adjusting his schedule for the cleaning and rotation. Marco's face was masterfully neutral. He's adjusting his schedule. The reason is his own business. Right. She nodded slowly. Tell him thank you. Marco turned to leave. She stopped herself. He turned back. Marco, has he always been like this? Or was there a before? Marco was quiet for a moment, long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Before Nico died, he said finally, this house had music in it, not just yours. He held her gaze for exactly 1 second. Good night, Ms. Marsh. He walked away. Jolene stood alone in the hallway with that sentence settling into her like cold water finding its level. This house had music in it. She thought about the wound but never set clock, the photograph between the book and the brass, the meal that finally came back empty. She was not naive. She knew what kind of man Cassian Ferraro was. She had heard enough, noticed enough, understood enough in 3 weeks to know that his empire ran on fear and power, and the kind of violence that dressed itself in expensive suits and spoke quietly. She was not fooling herself into thinking that made him safe. But safe and good were not the same thing. And neither were dangerous and lost. She knew a lost man when she saw one. She'd grown up watching her father be one. The second major shift came 11 days later, and it came in the form of a Wednesday morning that started like any other and then didn't. Jolene was in the main hallway when she heard the sound. Low, hard, and cut off suddenly, the specific sound of a man trying not to make a sound while he's in pain. She stopped. It was coming from the study. Every rule said walk away. Every rule said not your business, not your place. Stay in your lane, stay employed, stay invisible. She knocked on the study door. Nothing. She knocked again. Mr. Ferraro? A pause, then. I said I didn't want to be disturbed. You didn't say that to me, sir. You said it to Marco. I wasn't there. She waited. Are you hurt? Silence. She tried the door. It opened. He was behind the desk, standing in a way that said he had been trying to sit down and the effort had not gone as planned. His right hand was braced on the desk surface. His face was doing the thing it did, the total lockdown. The absolute refusal to betray anything but his body was betraying plenty. The way his weight was distributed, the tension in his left shoulder, the angle of his jaw, he was in real pain, and he was furious about it. It's an old injury, he said before she could speak. Go back to work. Where? He looked at her. What? The injury. Where is it? She walked into the room. Back, ribs. I told you to. I heard you. She moved to his side of the desk without hesitating. I grew up the oldest of 5 kids in a house where the adults weren't always reliable. I've set a dislocated shoulder, treated 2 broken ribs, and once stitched up my brother's arm with a sewing kit because we couldn't afford the ER. I'm not asking to make conversation. I'm asking because it changes how I help. She looked at him directly. So where? For 10 full seconds, he just stared at her. Not angry, not cold, just stared. Like a man looking at something that doesn't match any category he's created for the world. Left shoulder, he said finally. Old scar tissue, it seizes up. Sit down. I don't need, sit down, Mr. Ferraro, please. She pulled a chair out from behind the desk. I'm not asking for your permission. I'm asking for your cooperation. There's a difference. He sat. What she did next was practical, careful, and completely void of either pity or performance. She worked through the tension with the steady hands of someone who had learned care as a form of necessity, not sentiment. No fuss, no dramatic proclamations. She just worked, and she was good at it, and within 4 minutes his breathing had changed. He was looking straight ahead at the wall. His jaw was unclenched for the first time since she'd entered the room. My mother had hands like that, he said very quietly. She said nothing, just kept working. Nico always said she could fix anything. A pause, the quality of the silence around him had changed entirely. Like something pressurized, slowly releasing. He was always right about things like that. The things that mattered. The small one, another pause. I was always right about the big things, strategy, business, the architecture of how to build power. His voice dropped further. He was right about people. Sounds like you balanced each other out, Jolene said. We did. And then with a rawness that didn't belong to the stone-faced man she'd been watching for 3 weeks, he said, I would trade every piece of this empire for one more day of being the person he thought I was. Jolene stopped. She didn't say anything. Not because she had nothing to say, but because some things don't need to be answered. They need to be witnessed. And she understood in the marrow of her mountain-raised bones the difference between the two. She stood there with him in that silence. And she did not flinch, and she did not look away, and she did not offer him the hollow comfort of words that would close back up around a wound that needed air. When she finally stepped back, his face was still composed. But his eyes were different. Something had moved behind them, something that had been locked in a room for 7 years, and had just for the first time found the door unlocked. Thank you, he said. The words were stiff, like muscles used after a long rest. Jolene. It was the first time he'd used her name. She picked up her cleaning caddy from where she'd set it by the door. She paused on her way out. For what it's worth, she said. A man who can still miss someone that much 7 years later, that's not weakness. That's the proof that the love was real. She looked back at him. Hold on to that, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. She walked out. Behind her in the study that had been a fortress for 7 years, Cassian Ferraro sat with both hands flat on the desk and his eyes closed. And somewhere in his chest, behind the scar tissue of every hard year and every harder choice, something that had been perfectly rigidly still moved. The words spread through the house the way words always spread in closed places without anyone meaning to spread it, without anyone being able to stop it. He had used her name. Petra heard it from one of the kitchen staff who had been passing the study hallway at the wrong or right moment. By that evening, every person on staff knew that Cassian Ferraro, who had not addressed a single employee by their first name in over 4 years, had said Jolene like it was a word he'd been holding in his mouth and finally decided to release. Nobody made a big thing of it. In that house, you didn't make big things of small things. But the atmosphere shifted the way it shifts before weather. Nothing you could point to exactly, but something in the air that wasn't there before. Jolene felt it. She ignored it. She had a daughter in West Virginia with a failing heart valve and a surgeon's timeline that was moving faster than her savings account, and she did not have the luxury of getting distracted by atmosphere. She called her sister that night the same way she called every night, standing in the corner of her small room with the phone pressed to her ear and her voice held carefully level. She asked about you today, her sister Dana said. 3 times, is Mama coming home soon? 3 times, Joe. Tell her soon. Jolene closed her eyes. Tell her I'm working on it. The hospital called again. They need a deposit to hold the surgical date, $20,000 by the end of next month, or they give the slot to someone else. $20,000 in 30 days. I'll figure it out, Jolene said. Joe, I'll figure it out, Dana. Her voice didn't shake. She would not let it shake. Kiss Rosie for me. Tell her I love her more than everything. She hung up and sat down on the edge of the bed and did what she only allowed herself to do in private. She pressed both hands to her face and breathed through the fear. Not past it, not around it, through it. 30 seconds of acknowledging exactly how terrified she was, and then she straightened up, and the fear went back into the box where she kept it, and she got up and she went to sleep. Because tomorrow she had work to do. The next morning, Marco was waiting for her at the bottom of the service stairs. Not casually, with the specific posture of a man executing an errand he had been given and wanted finished. "Mr. Ferraro would like to see you," he said, "after your morning rounds. His study 11 o'clock. Jolene looked at him steadily. "Did he say why?" "Mr. Ferraro doesn't explain his reasons to me, Ms. Marsh. He gives me the message, and I deliver it." "Right." She adjusted the supply caddy on her arm. "Tell him I'll be there." Marco nodded and walked away. Petra appeared at her elbow approximately 4 seconds later, which meant she had been listening from around the corner. "His study," Petra said. "He called you to his study." "I gathered." "Jolene." Petra touched her arm. "Be careful. I mean it this time. Not watch yourself in the hallway, careful. Real careful. Men like him, when they start letting someone in, it's because they want something, always." Jolene looked at her. "Or because they're lonely." Petra opened her mouth and then closed it again. It was the kind of answer that didn't leave room for argument, not because it was sharp, but because it was true, and truth has a weight that pushes back. "Just be careful," Petra said again, quieter this time. Jolene patted her hand and went to work. At 11 o'clock exactly, she knocked on the study door. "Come in." He was at the desk, standing, not sitting. She had noticed that he stood more than he sat, like a man who distrusted stillness, who needed to stay ready. There were papers in front of him, but he wasn't looking at them. He was looking at her. "Close the door," he said. She did. She stayed near it. "I looked at your contract," he said. "The salary structure. What we're paying you." Her pulse moved just slightly. She kept her face even. "Is there a problem?" "There's a gap." He crossed his arms. "Between what you're being paid and what you actually need. I want to correct it." She stared at him. "Excuse me?" "I'm offering you a raise." "How large a raise?" He told her the number was not a raise. It was a lifeline. It was the surgery deposit and then some stretched over the next 6 weeks. It was her daughter's heartbeat continuing past the age of 8. It was the specific, impossible number she had been lying awake calculating every night since Dana's call. She should have said yes. Anyone standing in that room in that position with a 7-year-old daughter running out of time, anyone should have said yes without hesitating. She said, "Why?" He looked at her like the question surprised him. "Because the work warrants it." "That's not why." A beat of silence. Something moved in his eyes, not irritation. Respect, maybe. The guarded kind. "Does the reason matter?" he asked. "It does to me." She held her ground. "I'm not a charity case, Mr. Ferraro. I came here to work, and I've worked. I'm not asking for anything I haven't earned. But if this is..." She stopped, chose her words with the precision of someone who knew that precision mattered here. "If this comes with an expectation I'm not aware of, I need to know that before I accept it." The silence that followed was long. He looked at her with the full weight of those harbor gray eyes, and she looked back, and neither of them moved. "I had a brother," he said finally, "who spent the last 3 years of his life running a medical fund for sick children, pediatric cases. He believed very specifically that a child's life should not be determined by the size of their parents' bank account." His voice was even, controlled, but underneath it, just barely detectable, was the low-frequency hum of grief that never fully resolved. He was right. He was almost always right about the things that mattered. A pause. "This is not charity. It is a correction. Consider it made in his name." Jolene stood very still. "Nico," she said softly. "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the photograph. The laughing man with his whole chest open. The clock wound but never set. 7 years of a house with no music in it. "I'll accept it," she said, "and I'll earn every dollar." "I know you will." He looked back at the papers on his desk. "That's why I offered it." She was almost at the door when he said, without looking up, "What's her favorite thing, the girl?" Jolene paused. "Fireflies," she said. She used to sit on the porch back home and catch them in a jar, just to look at them, then let them go. He nodded once slowly, like a man filing something away in a place he intends to keep. She left before either of them could say anything that couldn't be taken back. The first crack in the careful new order appeared 4 days later. His name was Vincent Caro, and he arrived at the house on a Tuesday afternoon with two men behind him and a smile that didn't reach past his teeth. He was a business associate, the kind of associate that arrived unannounced and whose unannounced arrivals were always a form of message rather than coincidence. Jolene was in the main sitting room when he walked through. She registered him the way she registered most things, quietly, completely storing details without appearing to collect them. The expensive watch, the way his two men positioned themselves without being told to, the way his smile, when it landed on her, shifted into something that had weight to it. New staff, he said to nobody in particular. She's part of the household, Marco said from behind him. His voice was about 4 degrees colder than usual. Charming. Vincent Caro looked at her a beat too long. What's your name? Before she could answer, Cassian appeared at the top of the stairs. He had heard the arrival. He had come down with the exact speed of a man who had calculated how quickly he needed to move. Vincent, his voice cut across the room like a blade. Clean, cold, precise. My office. Vincent's smile widened. He looked between Cassian and Jolene with the visible pleasure of someone who has found a pressure point and tested it. Of course. He followed Cassian without looking back. Jolene stood still in the sitting room and listened to the office door close down the hall. Marco caught her eye from across the room. His expression said, "Stay out of this." His expression also said, "This is a problem." She went back to work, but she moved closer to the hallway. Not obviously, just closer. The voices from the office were low, but Cassian's house had the acoustics of old construction, and she'd learned in 4 weeks where sound traveled. I heard you've been asking questions, Vincent said, about the Genoa situation. I ask questions about a lot of things. Cassian's voice, flat and final. It's how I maintain my position. Some questions make people nervous. Good. Nervous people make mistakes. Mistakes give me information. It's a system. A short silence, then Vincent's voice lower. People are starting to wonder if you're losing your focus, Cassian. A man in your position can't afford to get distracted. A calculated pause. By domestic concerns. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of something that pressed against the walls. When Cassian spoke again, his voice had gone so quiet it was almost inaudible. Almost. Clarify what you mean by domestic concerns, Vincent. Carefully. I'm just saying, the business requires a certain clarity of mind, a certain distance from soft things. Another pause, deliberate and pointed. Soft people. Jolene's hand had stopped moving on the shelf she was supposed to be dusting. Here's what I want you to hear. Cassian said, still quiet, still precise, still absolutely terrifying, in the particular way that very controlled people become terrifying when something threatens to break the control. Every person in my household is my concern. Every detail of my life is my business and mine alone. And the next time you come to my house and make implications about what I can and cannot afford to feel, I will remind you in terms you will not forget why people in this city do not give me unsolicited advice. A long-waited beat. Are we finished misunderstanding each other, Vincent? The sound of a chair moving. Footsteps. Always a pleasure, Cassian. Marco will see you out. Jolene was 2 rooms away and completely focused on a shelf she had already cleaned 3 times when Vincent Caro passed through the hallway. His smile when he glanced toward her was different now, thinner, considering. The smile of a man who has been handed a piece of information and is deciding what to do with it. She did not look away. She met it steady and direct. His smile faded. He left. Cassian found her in the supply corridor 20 minutes later. She didn't hear him coming, she never did with him, and she turned around to find him standing close enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly to look at him. That man, he said without preamble, if he comes to this house again when I'm not here, you don't let him in. Not for any reason, not under any framing he gives you. She met his eyes. Understood. If he tries to speak with you directly, I know how to handle men like that, she said. I've been handling them my whole life. Something moved in his face. I know you have. He said it quietly like a fact he had arrived at through observation and not assumption. That doesn't mean you should have to. She looked at him for a moment. Really looked at him. Not at the facade, not at the empire and the stone jaw and the 7 years of strategic coldness, but at the things she'd been watching move slowly and reluctantly back toward the surface. "Mr. Ferraro," she said carefully, "what did your brother think of your business?" He was very still. "What, did Nico know what you did?" "What it cost." A long silence, his jaw tightened. She watched him decide whether to shut down or stay open, and she watched it be the closest thing to an actual fight she'd seen on his face. "He knew," Cassian said. "He didn't approve. He never approved." His voice had gone low and rough in a way that had nothing to do with control and everything to do with truth. "He used to say that I was good at building things that would outlast me, but not at building things that were worth outlasting me." He stopped. Something flickered. "I used to think he was being naive." And now he looked at her, at this woman who had walked into his house with a worn canvas bag and a mountain melody, and the unnerving habit of saying exactly what was true at exactly the moment it was most difficult to hear. "Now I think he was the only person I've ever known who was genuinely never afraid of me," he said. "And I spent 15 years mistaking that for weakness." His voice dropped to almost nothing. "It wasn't weakness." "No," Jolene said, "it wasn't." He exhaled slow, long, the kind of breath that carries something out of the body that has been living there too long. He looked at the middle distance for a moment, then back at her. "I don't do this," he said. "I don't talk. I don't explain myself." "I know. So I don't know what this is." She considered that with the same honest directness she brought to everything. "I think," she said, "it's what happens when a person has been alone with something too long. It starts looking for a door." He was quiet. "I'm not a door," she added. "I'm just a woman who showed up and didn't pretend not to see what was in front of her." Something in his face, that deep buried thing that had been moving by degrees for weeks, shifted again. Not a smile still, but the landscape that a smile would need, the terrain being prepared. "The Vanchetti situation is escalating," he said abruptly, shifting gears with the precision of a man snapping a lid back onto something before it overflows. "I may need the house locked down for a few days. Additional security. I want you to stay inside the main building." "Is there danger?" "There's always danger," he said. "But not for you. Not if I can prevent it." She looked at him with those dark, direct eyes and said the thing that neither of them was supposed to say. "Is that a professional concern or a personal one?" 3 full seconds. "Go back to work, Jolene," he said. But the way he said her name was entirely different from how it had sounded the first time. Not careful, not measured, just real. The way you say a name that you've been quietly practicing in a part of your mind that you haven't admitted you've been using. She went back to work. She was humming before she reached the end of the corridor. She didn't even realize she was doing it. But he was still standing there, and he heard it, and he stayed there a few seconds longer than he needed to before he turned and went back to the weight of his empire. And Petra, who had been quietly witnessing this from the far end of the hallway, walked back to the kitchen, sat down, and pressed both hands over her mouth. Because she had worked in this house for 4 months. She had learned its rhythms, its silences, its rules. She had become very good at reading its moods. And she had never, not once in 4 months, seen Cassian Ferraro stand still for someone. Not until now. That night, while the house settled into its careful quiet, Marco placed a call that no one was supposed to know about. He stood in the car park at the edge of the property, away from the cameras, and he spoke in a low, fast voice to someone who answered on the first ring. "It's moving faster than expected," Marco said. "The woman, she's getting in." A pause on the other end. "That's a problem," the voice said. "Maybe," Marco said, "or maybe it's exactly what he needs." Another pause. Longer. "You know who she is," the voice said. "You know who sent her." Marco went very still. The night air moved around him, and he stood in it, and he felt the specific chill of information arriving too late to prevent what it was warning against. "What did you just say?" he asked. The voice told him. Marco stood in the dark for a long time after the call ended, staring at nothing, running calculations. Then he turned and walked back toward the house with the expression of a man who has just realized that the door that's been opening, the one that's letting in warmth and music, and a woman from the mountains who doesn't flinch, may not have opened by accident. And now he had to decide what to tell Cassian. Marco didn't sleep that night. He sat in his car in the garage for 2 hours with the engine off and the phone in his hand and the name he'd just been given sitting in his chest like a piece of broken glass. He turned it over, examined every angle, ran every scenario the way Cassian had trained him to run scenarios backward, forward from every entry point. And every time he arrived at the same conclusion, he started over because the conclusion was one he did not want to be right about. By 4 in the morning, he accepted that it was right. He went inside. He did not go to Cassian, not yet. He needed 24 hours to verify. Because what he was carrying was the kind of information that delivered wrong, delivered early, delivered without full confirmation, could detonate something that no one in this house was ready to survive. Cassian least of all. So Marco waited. And watching him wait, if anyone had been watching, would have looked a great deal like a man carrying a lit match toward a room full of things he loved. Jolene woke at 5, the same as always, and called Dana before she got dressed. She slept all night, Dana said, and Jolene closed her eyes and let that sentence move through her like warm water. No episodes? Ate a full breakfast yesterday? Asked me to save the fireflies until you come home. Tell her I will, Jolene said. Tell her I'm coming home soon. Tell her. Her voice caught just barely, just enough. She pressed through it. Tell her Mama is fixing it. Joe, Dana's voice softened. Are you okay over there? Are you actually okay? I'm fine. That's not what I asked. Jolene sat with the phone pressed to her ear and looked at the wall of her small room and thought about a man who had eaten a full meal for the first time in years because she'd told him the food was getting cold. She thought about a name said in a low voice that wasn't careful anymore. She thought about a folder on a desk that had never been opened in her presence but that she knew existed. She thought about Vincent Caro's eyes and the smile that had thinned when she held his gaze. It's complicated, she said finally. Complicated how? The kind of complicated that I don't know how to explain and wouldn't know where to start. Dana was quiet for a moment. Joe, you're not getting attached to something that can't end well, are you? I'm doing my job. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have right now. She stood up. Kiss Rosie. I'll call tonight. She hung up and went to work. The morning moved the way mornings moved in that house, with its own particular quiet, its own particular rhythms, the careful choreography of people maintaining distance from each other and from the one man whose mood set the temperature for everything else. But something was different. Cassian was up before her. That had never happened. She arrived at the main corridor at 5:40 to find the lights already on in the east wing and the faint sound of movement from behind the study door. Not the contained, careful movement of a man at work. Something else. Pacing, maybe. She went about her routine without disturbing it. At 7, Marco appeared at the kitchen door and looked at her with the specific expression she had learned in the past month to read as meaning something significant was in motion below the surface. He didn't say anything, just looked at her long enough to communicate that she should be aware, and then he poured coffee and left. At Odit, Cassian came out of the study. He looked like a man who had been wrestling something all night and hadn't won. Not disheveled, he was never disheveled, but carrying himself with a fractional difference in weight distribution, the way a person moves when they are tired in a place that sleep doesn't reach. He stopped when he saw her. You're early. I'm always early, she said. You're earlier. Something almost moved on his face. I couldn't sleep. She waited. She'd learned that he sometimes needed a runway. I made a decision last night, he said. He crossed his arms, then uncrossed them, a rare small betrayal of restlessness. About something Nico used to push me toward. A fund, medical, pediatric cases. He looked at her with a directness that was different from his usual directness, less guarded, more deliberate. I'm setting it up. I want it running within the month. Jolene went very still. Cassian, he held up a hand. It was the first time she'd used his name without the title, and neither of them commented on it, and both of them noticed. This is not about your daughter specifically, he said. I want that clear. Rosie will be taken care of through the arrangement we already discussed. This is larger. This is for the ones who don't have someone in their corner. He paused. Nico spent 3 years on this idea. I spent 3 years telling him it was sentimental. I was wrong. His voice was even, but beneath it was something resolving itself, some internal argument reaching its conclusion after a very long time. He deserved better than a brother who confused practicality with wisdom. Jolene looked at him for a long moment. He'd be proud of you, she said, for this. You didn't know him. I know you, she said, and then she heard herself say it and felt the room change temperature. I mean, I know what you've shown me in the past weeks. That's enough to extrapolate. He looked at her with those still gray eyes. Is it? Yes, she held the look. Nico sounds like someone who saw the best version of you. I think she stopped, recalculated, kept going anyway. I think that version is still there. I think it's been there this whole time. It just didn't have anyone to show up for. The silence was long and full. You say things, he said quietly, that no one in my world would dare say to me. I know. It should bother me more than it does. I know that too. For one moment, one suspended, impossible moment, the stone face cracked. Not widely. Just at one corner, just one fractional movement upward, the ghost of something that his face had forgotten how to complete. Not quite a smile, but the shape that a smile would take if it were allowed to. Then Marco walked in, and the expression that Marco was wearing was enough to kill the moment completely. I need to speak with you, Marco said. His voice was the voice he used when the information was serious. Cassian knew that voice the way a soldier knows the specific sound of incoming. Now, Cassian asked. Now, Marco said, privately. Jolene was already stepping back. I'll be in the east corridor. Stay, Cassian said. Not a request. She stilled. He looked at Marco. Whatever you have to say, say it. Marco's eyes moved to Jolene briefly, then back to Cassian. In 12 years, Marco had delivered bad news of every category. He had told Cassian about betrayals, about deaths, about business catastrophes that required immediate and violent correction. His face in those moments was always the same controlled, professional, precise. Right now, his face looked like a man who genuinely did not want to do what he was about to do. The call I made last night, Marco said. I was following up on something from the Vanchetti situation. A name that came up in connection with new household staff. He stopped. Jolene, the referral that brought her application here, the agency that submitted her file. Another stop. It's connected to Vincent Caro's network. The room went absolutely cold. Cassian did not move. He stood with his coffee in his hand, and the expression on his face went through 3 distinct phases in less than 2 seconds: processing, calculation, and then something that was neither of those things. Something that had no professional category. Something that was simply a man having the thing he had just started to let himself feel turned into a question. He turned and looked at Jolene. She was standing with her supply caddy at her side, and her face had gone through its own transformation from still to stricken to a controlled, deliberate blankness that he recognized because it was the same face he put on when he needed time to think before he responded. Jolene, he said, very quiet, tell me what you know about the agency that placed you here. I found it through a job board online, she said. Her voice was level. I submitted my information and they called me within 2 days and they fast-tracked the application. I thought it was because of my experience. She paused. I thought it was luck. You didn't know anyone connected to this household before you applied. No. No connection to Vincent Caro. No contact from his organization. No one offered you anything in exchange for no. Her voice stayed level, but something behind her eyes was very carefully not falling apart. No, Mr. Ferraro Cassian. I came here for one reason. My daughter needs surgery. I needed money. That is the entire truth of it. He looked at her. He looked at her the way he had looked at her the very first morning in the corridor, measuring precise reading every layer simultaneously. For 20 long seconds, nobody in the room breathed. Leave us, he said to Marco. Cassian, he saw. Leave us, Marco. Marco left, but his expression as he passed Jolene was not suspicious. It was the expression of a man who believed her and was afraid that belief was no longer the most important variable. The door closed. Cassian set his coffee down. He walked to the window. He stood with his back to her for a long moment, and she watched the tension move through his shoulders and his jaw and his hands, and she did not fill the silence because she understood that this was a moment that required patience above everything else. You understand what this looks like, he said finally. Not to the window, to her over his shoulder. I understand what it could look like to someone who doesn't know the truth, she said. Yes. In my world, the appearance of a thing and the truth of a thing are often the same thing. Because people who want to get close to me arrange for both to exist simultaneously. He turned around. His face was back to the stone, but it was different now, not the practiced stone of a man who had decided to feel nothing, but the desperate stone of a man who was trying to protect something he had only just allowed himself to have. The most effective way to get to a man like me is not through his enemies. It is through the door he forgets to lock. And you think I'm that door. I think someone may have built you into one without your knowledge. His voice was careful, controlled, and completely honest, which is worse in some ways, because it means I can't be angry at you. And right now, having something to be angry at would be considerably easier. Jolene set down her supply caddy. She crossed her arms and looked at him with the full weight of everything. She was a mountain woman who had driven 18 hours to save her daughter's life, who had cleaned his house and talked to him like a person, and put her hands on his shoulder without flinching, and told him that his grief was proof of love. She looked at him with all of that and she said, "Oh, well, then ask me what you actually need to ask me. Don't talk around it." His jaw tightened. Did any part of coming here, staying here, getting close to this household, did any part of that serve a purpose beyond what you've told me? No. Did anyone contact you before or after your arrival with instructions of any kind? No. If someone had approached you, offered money, offered information about your daughter's surgery in exchange for something, would you have taken it? The silence before her answer was exactly 2 seconds long. Long enough to be honest, short enough to be real. 2 months ago, she said slowly, before I knew you, before I knew any of this, if someone had come to me and said, "Do this one small thing and your daughter lives," I cannot tell you with certainty what I would have done. She held his gaze without flinching. I can tell you what I would do now, and the answer is no, not for anything. The room was so quiet that the clock in the hallway was audible. "Why now and not before?" he asked. "Because now I know you," she said, "and you don't betray people you know. Not for anything. That's not a rule someone taught me. It's just who I am." He stood very still. He looked at her for a long time. The stone face held, but behind it in those harbor gray eyes, something was working very hard at something, not belief exactly. Recognition, the specific, exhausting recognition of a man who has built his entire life on the assumption that everyone has a price and a purpose, confronting the possibility that he has been wrong. That some people are simply what they appear to be. That sometimes a woman from West Virginia with worn hands and a mountain song is just that and nothing else. "I want to believe you," he said, and it came out raw the way only true things come out when a man stops managing them. "That is a highly unusual position for me to be in." "I know," she said. "I'm sorry it's hard." "Don't apologize for that." "Okay." Another silence, softer this time. "I'm going to find out how your file reached that agency," he said. "And when I do, if there is any connection, any thread at all, you'll tell me," she said. Not a request, a statement, a requirement. He looked at her. "Yeah, I'll tell you." "Then we're agreed." She picked up her supply caddy. "I'm going to go do my job now because my daughter needs me to keep this job, and I am not going to let Vincent Caro or anyone else take it from her. Or from me." She walked to the door. She stopped. "Cassian." She didn't turn around. "Whatever you find, I need you to look at it with both eyes open. The ones that built an empire and the ones that have been opening back up these last few weeks." She paused. "Don't let fear close them again. Please." She walked out. He stood in the study alone for a long time. Then he sat down, which was unusual, and he put both hands flat on the desk, which was also unusual. And he stayed like that, completely still, doing something he had not done in 7 years, which was to simply sit with something he was feeling without immediately turning it into action. Marco found him like that 20 minutes later and said nothing. The answer came faster than anyone expected. By 4 that afternoon, Marco had the full picture. He laid it out in the study with the careful precision of a man who had prepared for the conversation to go badly and was hoping it wouldn't. The employment agency was connected to Caro's network, yes. But the connection was old legacy infrastructure from a business arrangement that had ended 2 years prior. The agency still operated independently. They had not been directed to place Jolene. They had processed her application the same way they processed hundreds of others, and the fast track had been exactly what it appeared: a staffing shortage and a highly qualified candidate. Jolene Marsh had not been sent. She had arrived. The coincidence of the agency connection was real. The conspiracy was not. Cassian sat with this information for a full minute. She didn't know, Marco said. Oh, no. And there's no active intelligence operation. No. A pause. Caro used the connection to rattle me, Cassian said with the quiet, cold certainty of a man connecting the final dots. He already knew about the agency when he visited. He was seeding doubt, waiting for someone to pull the thread and find enough smoke to make me question my own judgment. Marco nodded. He knows something has changed in this house. He's trying to compromise it before it stabilizes. Cassian stood up. His jaw was set. His eyes were clear, and the man who moved across that room was not the exhausted, conflicted figure from that morning. He was something older and more certain and considerably more dangerous. "Where's Jolene?" he said. "East corridor." He went. Marco watched him go with an expression that was quietly, carefully hopeful in a way that he would have denied if anyone had pointed it out. She was folding linens in the upper corridor when he found her. He stopped a few feet away. She turned around and read his face instantly, the clear eyes, the set jaw, the fractional release of tension in his shoulders. "It wasn't you," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I know. I know you know. I'm saying it anyway." He stepped closer. "I'm saying it because you deserved to hear it said out loud by me." She nodded. Her hands were still holding the linen. Her knuckles were slightly white because she had been holding herself together all day with everything she had, and hearing those words come from him in that voice with that particular weight, something in her chest unclenched that had been clenched for hours. "Thank you," she said. "Caro played us both," Cassian said. "That ends now." "What are you going to do, Tayo?" "What I should have done the moment he walked into my house and looked at you the way he did." The quiet certainty in his voice was not anger. It was something older and more measured than anger. Resolution. I'm going to remind him in terms he will not forget that some things in my life are not negotiable. She looked at him, at this man, at the 7 years of walls, and the photograph of a laughing brother, and the meal that finally came back empty, and the name said in the dark, in a voice that had stopped being careful. "And what are those things?" she asked. "The non-negotiable ones." He looked at her. And the stone face, that monument to protected grief, that 7-year architecture of deliberate coldness, did something it hadn't done in longer than most people in that house had worked there. It softened, not all the way, maybe not even halfway, but enough to see what was underneath, enough to see the man in the photograph, younger, lighter, laughing with his whole chest because he was safe, still there, still present, waiting. "I'm still working that out," he said. His voice was quiet and real and entirely unguarded. "But you're in the list." The linen in Jolene's hands went still. From somewhere downstairs, Petra dropped a dish. The sound of it breaking echoed through the house, and both of them almost smiled at the interruption. And the almost smiling was so close to the real thing that neither of them quite knew what to do with it. "Go back to work," he said. And now there was something in the way he said it that was warm, that was almost teasing, that sounded like a man who had remembered somewhere in the past few weeks that warmth was something he was capable of. "Yes, sir," she said. "Cassian." She looked at him. "My name," he said. "You used it this morning. Use it." A beat, a small certain moment. "Yes, Cassian," she said, and she went back to work, and he went back to his empire. And somewhere between those two things, between her mountain melody and his harbor gray eyes, and the distance that was quietly, irreversibly closing between them, something had changed. Finally, completely. In the way that only real things change all at once, and in both directions, and with no possibility of going back. The name spread through the criminal network the way Cassian intended it to, like cold water finding every crack. By Wednesday morning, Vincent Caro had received 3 separate messages. None of them written, none of them signed, all of them saying the same thing in the language that men in that world understood better than any spoken word you miscalculated. Correct it now, or face the correction. Cassian did not wait for a response. He never waited for responses. He moved. The Vanchetti connection was severed by Thursday, not Not violently, not loudly, but with the precise and permanent finality of a man who had decided the conversation was over. Business arrangements dissolved, accounts closed, 2 phone calls made, each lasting under 4 minutes, each ending with the other party agreeing to things they had not expected to agree to. Marco watched it happen with the quiet respect of a man who had witnessed Cassian operate for 12 years and still occasionally found himself impressed. Clean, Marco asked. Clean, and Cassian confirmed. He was already moving to the next thing. The fund documentation, where are we? Lawyers have the framework. They need your signature on 3 forms and a name for the foundation. Cassian picked up the pen, signed the first form, the second, paused at the third, the one with the blank line for the foundation name. He sat with it for a moment. Then he wrote 2 words, Nico's Light. He set the pen down and did not look at what he'd written again. He handed the folder to Marco and said, "Get it done," and went back to work. But his hand, when he placed it flat on the desk, pressed down harder than necessary for just a moment, like a man laying something to rest. Marco took the folder and said nothing. But in the hallway alone, he stopped walking for 3 full seconds and looked at the ceiling and breathed. Jolene found out about the foundation the way she found out about most things in that house, indirectly, through the texture of things shifting around her. Miss Bianchi mentioned it carefully and without preamble while reviewing the week's schedule. "The lawyers were here this morning," she said. "Mr. Ferraro is establishing a charitable foundation, pediatric medical cases. It will be announced publicly next week." Jolene kept writing the linen inventory she was cataloging. "That's good," she said. Her voice was even. "He named it after his brother." Her pen stopped. "Nico's Light," Mrs. Bianchi said, and her voice, for the first time in Jolene's experience, had something in it that was not managerial composure. Something quieter. Something that had been waiting a long time to feel something like hope. Jolene set the pen down carefully. She looked at the inventory sheet in front of her. Then she picked the pen back up and kept writing, because if she stopped, now she would not be able to finish, and there was still work to do. "Good," she said again, quietly, completely. "That's really good." The call from Dana came at noon. Jolene was in the Essex corridor when her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. She checked it, saw Dana's name, and felt the specific cold rush that the sight of that name during work hours always produced. She answered before the second ring. "Joe." Dana's voice was strange. Not bad strange. Strange like a person who is trying to hold something very large inside a very normal tone. "I need you to listen to me." "I'm listening." "The hospital called this morning about Rosie's surgery." A pause. "The full amount was paid. The surgical date is confirmed. They said..." Dana's voice broke slightly, then recovered. "They said an anonymous donor covered the entire cost. Joe, the entire thing. And they said it was designated specifically for Rosie, by name." Jolene stopped walking. She stood in the east corridor of Cassian Ferraro's house, with her phone against her ear and her cleaning caddy at her side, and she felt everything she had been holding compressed in her chest for months. The weight of it, the calculation of it, the cold arithmetic of love and money and time running out, release, all at once, like a fist slowly opening. She pressed her free hand against the wall to steady herself. "Joe, are you there?" "I'm here." Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "Do you know who?" "Yes," she said, "I know." Dana started crying on the other end. Jolene listened to her sister cry and felt tears run down her own face and did nothing about them because there was nobody in the corridor, and some moments are larger than the rules you live by. "She's going to be okay," Dana said. "Joe, she's going to be okay." "I know," Jolene said. "I know she is." She stood against that wall for another full minute after she hung up. Then she wiped her face, straightened up, picked up her caddy, and went to find him. He was in the study. Of course he was. She knocked once and opened the door without waiting. He looked up from the desk, took one look at her face, the red eyes she hadn't quite managed to clear, the set of her jaw, the way she was holding herself like a woman trying to contain something enormous. And he set down whatever he was holding and gave her his full attention. "You didn't have to do that anonymously," she said. "I would have let you." "I know." His voice was even. "That's not why I did it that way." "Then why?" He leaned back slightly. "Because Rosie doesn't need to grow up thinking her life was saved by a favor. She needs to grow up knowing her mother worked for everything and fought for everything and got it." He held her gaze. The anonymous part was for her, not you. Jolene stood in the middle of his study and looked at this man, this iron-jawed, harbor-eyed, 7 years locked man who had named a charity after his dead brother and paid for a little girl's heart surgery in secret so she'd never feel like a debt. And she understood with complete clarity that she had already passed the point where any reasonable professional boundary was going to save her from caring about him. That point had likely passed somewhere around the empty dinner plate or the shoulder or the first time he said her name like it was real. "Thank you," she said, "for Rosie, for Nico's light, for," she stopped, "for letting someone see you." Something in his face moved. "You didn't give me much choice. You could have fired me." "Twice," he agreed, "at least." And there it was, the thing his face had been building toward for 6 weeks, the thing the stone had been holding back since the night his world ended, and he decided that the safest architecture was one with no windows. A smile. Small, crooked, arrived at with difficulty and completely real. "I'm glad I didn't." Jolene felt it move through her like a current. That smile. Like watching a door open in a house that had been locked for 7 years and finding on the other side not emptiness, but a room full of light that had been waiting the entire time. "Me too," she said. It was Petra who told her 3 days later what she had apparently been the last person in the house to understand. They were in the kitchen at the end of the day, and Petra was being entirely too casual about refilling her coffee for someone with something to say. "He asked Mrs. Bianchi about your contract this morning," Petra said, studying her cup. "What about it?" "Whether it was structured in a way that could be modified." She paused. "Significantly." Jolene looked at her. "He asked about living arrangements," Petra continued, still not making eye contact. "For an employee with a child, whether the East Guest Suite could be converted to a family accommodation." The kitchen was very quiet. "Petra," Jolene said, "Ocean, I'm just telling you what I heard. He didn't say anything to me." "No?" Petra finally looked up. "Because he's Cassian Ferraro and he's been alone for 7 years and he's terrified." She said it with the matter-of-fact directness of someone who has watched a situation develop from close range and run out of patience for watching people dance around the obvious. "He doesn't know how to ask for what he wants anymore. He forgot. You might have to help him remember." Jolene sat with that for a long moment. "He's still the man he is," she said carefully. "The empire, the business. That doesn't disappear because he smiles." "No," Petra agreed, "it doesn't." A beat. "But you already knew that when you walked into this house. You knew exactly what kind of man was at the end of that hallway, and you knocked on his study door anyway." She tilted her head. "Because some things matter more than being safe." Jolene looked at the table. "Rosie," she said. "Rosie needs her mother whole," Petra said firmly. "Happy. That's what she needs." The kitchen was quiet again. Then Jolene stood up, straightened her apron, and said, "Where is he at garden?" Petra said. "He goes out at 7 every evening, has for the past week." A pause. "Mayon." "He never used to go outside." He was standing at the edge of the garden with his hands in his coat pockets and his face turned up slightly, the way a person stands when they are not looking at anything specific, but simply deciding to exist in a space for a moment instead of moving through it. The evening air moved around him, and for once, for the first time she had seen, his shoulders were not carrying the full weight of the architecture he'd built to survive. He heard her. He always heard her. "You didn't have to come find me," he said. "I know." She stopped beside him, close enough to be deliberate. "I wanted to." He turned and looked at her. Fully. The way he'd started looking at her in these past weeks, not measuring, not reading for threat, just looking, seeing her. "I spoke to my lawyers today about the foundation board," he said. "I want someone on it who understands what it's actually for, not the financial architecture of it, the human part." A pause. "I'd like that to be you." She stared at him. "I'm a maid." "You were a maid," he said. "You're also the reason the thing exists, and you're the most practically compassionate person I've ever met, which is a more useful qualification for this work than any degree." He held her gaze. "I'm asking, not as your employer, just asking. That's 2 things you've offered me in the past 2 weeks that are larger than anything I came here for," she said. "I know. You should know that I don't take things I haven't earned. You've earned both. His voice was certain. I've been watching you work for 6 weeks. I know exactly what you're worth, and it is considerably more than what this house has been giving you. She looked at him, at the man who had cracked the desk and never smiled and wound the clock but never said it. The man who said his dead brother's name like a wound that was slowly finally beginning to close. I need to bring Rosie here, she said. After the surgery, when she's recovered enough to travel, she steadied herself. I need her close to me. I already spoke to Mrs. Bianchi about the East guest suite. Jolene blinked. Petra told me, but you hadn't said anything to me. He had the expression of a man who has been caught preparing for something he wasn't sure he'd be allowed to do. I wasn't certain you'd want to stay. After the Caro situation. After everything. He looked at her directly. I wasn't sure I'd earned the right to ask. Cassian. She said his name the way it had started to sound like a word she'd decided to keep. Ask me. By a long moment, the evening was still around them. Day, he said, simply, completely. Not as staff, not because of Rosie's surgery or the foundation or any arrangement. Stay because he stopped, started again. The man who ran an empire with 4-minute phone calls and never repeated himself was choosing his words with unusual care. Because this house hasn't had music in it for 7 years, and in the past 6 weeks it has. And I don't want to go back to what it was before you got here. Jolene stood with the evening air around her and the weight of 18 hours of driving and a child with a fixed heart in a worn canvas bag that she'd arrived with, and a man who had just used the word music to mean everything he didn't yet know how to say directly. I'm not easy, she told him. I'm stubborn and I'm direct, and I'll tell you when I think you're wrong and I won't apologize for it. I know, he said. I'm counting on it. And Rosie comes first. Always. That is not a condition I will ever ask you to negotiate. She looked at him. This man, this impossible, difficult, grief-hollowed, slowly opening man. Then yes, she said, I'll stay. The night Rosie's surgery was confirmed successful, Cassian did something he had not done in 7 years. He sat in the main dining room. Not alone, Mrs. Bianchi was there, and Marco and Petra, who had been invited with the careful awkwardness of a man who was relearning how to include people in things. The table was set for 6 instead of 1. Jolene sat across from him with the phone in her hand, and Dana's voice still in her ear saying, she's out of surgery, Joe, she's out, and she's asking for you. And when she looked up, Cassian was watching her with those harbor gray eyes, and the expression on his face was the one she'd been watching build for 6 weeks. Complete. Unguarded. Real. She's okay, Jolene said. Her voice broke on the last word and she let it. She's okay. Marco picked up his glass. Mrs. Bianchi pressed a hand to her chest. Petra made a sound that was mostly a sob rerouted at the last second through a smile. Cassian said nothing. He didn't have to. He reached across the table, not dramatically, not with ceremony, simply with the quiet deliberateness of a man who has decided to stop performing distance, and covered her hand with his. His hand was steady. Hers was shaking. She turned her hand over and held his back. The dinner table of Cassian Ferraro, which had been set for 1 and come back barely touched for 7 years, was full that night. Full of people. Full of sound. Full of the specific earned warmth of a house that has been empty for a long time and has finally decided to be otherwise. 3 weeks later, Rosie Marsh arrived. She was 7 years old and small for her age, with her mother's dark eyes and a scar on her chest that she showed off to everyone who would look with the magnificent pride of a child who had survived something and knew it. She had a pink backpack and a mason jar she'd brought empty from West Virginia specifically for catching fireflies, and she walked through the front door of Cassian Ferraro's mansion with the complete unself-conscious confidence of a person who has not yet learned to be afraid of large spaces or powerful men. She stopped in the main hallway, looked around, looked up at the ceiling, looked at the staircase, looked at the man standing at the end of the hall, the big dark-haired man with the gray eyes and the jaw and the 7 years of quiet written all over him, and she tilted her head and said, "Are you the man my mama works for?" Cassian crouched down to her level. It was not something his body had done in a very long time. "I am." Rosie considered him. "Mama says you're complicated." Something moved on his face. "She's right. She also says you're good." Rosie's head was still tilted. "She doesn't call a lot of people good." so I believe him. Cassian looked at this child with the scar and the mason jar and the complete and total lack of fear, and something in his face did what it had been doing more frequently. In the past 3 weeks, it moved toward warmth the way a man moves toward a fire after a long time in the cold. Not rushing, just grateful for the direction. Are there fireflies here? Rosie asked. In the garden, he said, after dark. Her eyes went wide. Can I catch them? You can catch them, look at them, and let them go, he said. That's the rule. She nodded seriously. That's my rule, too. She held up the mason jar. I already have the jar. Behind them, Jolene stood in the doorway with her canvas bag over one shoulder and something in her chest so full it had no name for it. She watched the stone-faced man and her daughter negotiate the terms of firefly capture with equal seriousness, and she thought about 18 hours of driving in a job board and luck that perhaps was not entirely luck. And she thought about photographs between books and clocks wound, but not set, and meals that finally came back empty. She thought about the things a person loses and the things they find, and the impossible unearned grace of discovering that sometimes those two things are connected, that loss can become a door if you're brave enough to go through it, and on the other side is not an ending, but something that was always waiting to begin. Marco appeared at her shoulder. He looked at the scene in the hallway. Then he looked at Jolene. Welcome home, he said. It came out slightly rougher than he intended, and he cleared his throat and looked away. Jolene didn't answer him. She watched Cassian stand up with Rosie's hand in his, the big empire-built hand, and the small surgery-scarred one, and walk her toward the garden to show her where the light came from after dark. And somewhere in that moment, everything that had been broken in that house, not fixed, not erased, but slowly, honestly rebuilt into something that could hold weight again, became what it had always had the capacity to be, a home. In the garden that night, as the first firefly lifted off the grass and Rosie's laugh split the darkness open like a bell, Cassian. Ferraro looked at the light in a child's hands and felt something move through him that he had not felt since the last time his brother laughed, clean and real and entirely without armor. He smiled, not the ghost of one, not the almost, not the landscape of one being prepared. He smiled full and real and irreversible, and the man in the photograph, the one who had seemed so impossibly lost, was standing right there in the garden, exactly where he'd always been, waiting for someone brave enough not to look away. Jolene saw it from across the garden. She pressed a hand to her mouth. Her eyes filled, and she let them. Because some things are worth every mile of the drive to get there. Some things are worth the 18 hours in the worn bag, and the rules you broke, and the silences you held, and the doors you knocked on, even when every rule said walk away. Some things, a child's laugh, a man's first real smile in 7 years, a house that has learned to hold warmth again, are worth every single bit of the hard road it took to find them. And all of this was exactly that. This was worth it. Every step, every mile, every morning, she chose to stay. And she was never, not for one day of what came after, going to let herself forget it.